That was the famous little prelude, originally in C minor, but played by us on the guitar in D minor. Bach Werke Verzeichnis, that means BWV, that number you see, BWV, that means Bach Werke Verzeichnis. Bach Works Catalog, or the catalog of Bach's works that was begun by a man named Schmieder some years back. And that prelude, of course, is very famous. Originally, evidently, conceived as a lute piece, but known to every beginning piano student as a piano piece, even though the piano, of course, only came into existence near the end of Bach's life. There are so many things you could say about Bach that you could probably fill 15 or 15,000 or 15 million videos and still never get really to the true essence and majesty and mystery of what he communicates to our species, our human race. I've always loved Bach since I was a child, and as a child I had, of course, Segovia's recording of this piece, a wonderful recording, I might add. And Segovia, of course, also published a transcription, published by Schott. And when I was a kid, Schott has these beautiful covers here, with Segovia's, nice picture of Segovia and list of his works. And for all of us students, this was sort of a gradus ad Parnassum, the way to the mountain of Parnassus, the mythical mountain of Parnassus, where the arts supposedly flourished and the source of all culture was to be found. Segovia's editions were, for all of us, that kind of an inspiration. But unfortunately, Schott nowadays has this ugly cover. Look at this. This is not Segovia's hand. This is not Segovia's guitar. And it's really a disgrace. I don't know why they decided to change from something so beautiful to something so ugly. But anyway, they did. That's not what this video is about, but rather about trying to get near to this wonderful work of Bach. The facsimile of the manuscript is here. It's been reproduced many times. This version I took from the recent book entitled Segovia, published by Graham Wade and Gerard Garneau. But of course it's been reproduced many times. You can see this original is very, very hard to read. But it's wonderful to have it. It's not in Bach's hand, but rather in the hand of a student of his named Kellner. This is the signature of Kellner down here. So it's a mixture, really. It seems to be a mixture of languages. Prelude in C-moll, Prelude in C minor, that's the original key. Pour la lutte, for the lute, by Johann Sebastian Bach. And here's the guy who made the copy, his pupil, Kellner. So trying to get near to this piece, we have a lot of approaches. I've now sort of adumbrating a musicological approach. In other words, thinking about the instrument for which this piece was intended. The Baroque lute was quite, and remains, it is now beginning to be played again by people who are interested in original instruments and things. Of course, the Baroque lute is a famously difficult instrument. In its heyday, it had 13 courses of strings. That means some of the strings were double strings, like the 12-string guitar today. So the lute had more than twice as many strings as this instrument, and of course you know the pear shape of the lute, and then had a sort of naturally wider fingerboard to accommodate all these strings here, and then the neck was bent back. You know, a lot of pieces by Bach have this kind of lute style arpeggiation, right? The first prelude from the Ultima Clavier has that sort of lute configuration, or one of the Bach cello suites, the fourth. All these sort of arpeggiated preludes suggest very much the lute, and the so-called style brisé, or broken style, meaning arpeggiated style, meaning you have a chord, in this case this chord, and it's arpeggiated. Well, there are, for example, there's a suite by Weiss, does something like that, uses this same kind of arpeggio, but only, let's say this, back and forth, relatively simple arpeggio. Now, Bach, being Bach, is going to find the most fantastic way to do this arpeggio, the most creative way. So he doesn't just go up and down, but he figures out this jazzy way to do it. much more interesting arpeggio, much more interesting style than any of his lesser, if very talented, but still, of course, lesser than him, contemporaries. When I approach this piece, I start, first of all, from a musical basis. In fact, I made kind of a sketch of it using various types of analysis. One was just, first of all, reducing these chords that you see to block chords so that I could follow the voice leading. Then there's another version I did here using figured bass symbols. And I'll get into that in a minute. And then finally, kind of a Schenker analysis, a sketch, looking for the fundamental voice leading that is involved in this piece. A lot of that, of course, is very technical, and I don't need to get into that right here, but just to suggest different ways of approaching the piece in a purely musical way. What was figured bass? Figured bass is something that is absolutely fundamental to the Baroque style. Figured bass, or Generalbass, as it was called in German. And the idea is that you have this bass bass line is always present. That's why the Italians called it the basso continuo, the continuous bass. You always have this bass, a typical bass line. For example, that's a typical, very typical Baroque bass line. But basically, you've got four harmonies. Something like this, and you can accompany it in various ways. What the basso continuo is helpful for is understanding the structure of a piece, because it's sort of like a musical shorthand. The same thing that popular musicians today use in terms of chord charts, things like that. It's just a Baroque version of that. So when we analyze the opening of this piece, we see we have this chord, and then this chord, and then this chord, and then this. Bach sort of signs his name, if you will, in D minor. Has a 1 chord, a 4 chord, a dominant chord, in this case the 7 chord, and back to the 1. So what's happening here is above a pedal, we always have this pedal, he does this, he does 1, 4, 5, 1. Would be another version of doing it if I were accompanying in Baroque style. As far as technically learning how to play this piece, putting it onto the guitar, there are a lot of things you could do. You could, first of all, obviously you practice anything to get it up to tempo, you practice it slowly. And in fact, most people play this piece a lot more slowly than I do. Well, I think on the guitar people usually play it. Of course, a completely different feeling. But that's the thing about Bach. You can expand Bach, you play him very, very slow. You can contract, you play it very, very fast. And it always works because the internal proportions are right and just and fitting. Anytime you have a technical difficulty, the main thing is to break a larger segment into smaller pieces. That's the way we solve every technical problem. If you're thinking that you have to play, 40 notes in a row or something like that, your mind is going to short circuit after a certain point. So what you want to do is break those 40 notes up into 10 groups of 4, let's say, so that your mind, after each smaller group, can take a little rest, and you won't get tripped up in your own feet, or by your own feet, so to speak. So for example, this arpeggio, which looks very complicated, is also composed of component parts, and it's a fairly consistent pattern that goes through the entire piece. So the first part is, of course, easy. If we just had to play this, and we had lots of time, we could do it quite easily. So maybe a first thing that you could do would be just to get a feel for that. And then you can add onto that. So we have to practice this. Look at this. And that has its own poetry. The whole idea of an arpeggio is an interesting idea. Arpeggio comes from, really the word relates to harp, right? So we associate it with any kind of a rolled chord. And of course, Bach was a master of arpeggio. He found all kinds of interesting ways of doing arpeggios. An arpeggio, you just take a chord, and then you turn it into a harp-like sound, let's say. So you can go up, you can go down, you can go up, and then to the middle, and then down, and then up, or there's a little prelude by De Murcia, in fact, the great Baroque guitarist that does exactly that arpeggio. Weiss, the great lutenist, contemporary of Bach, also uses arpeggios. Just going up, down, in interesting ways. Now this is, of course, kind of interesting. What's interesting is you have different rhythms created. For example, so that, what I'm doing there is cutting out the top note. Let's say I don't play this top note, but I leave it out, and I just play the bass and the middle voice. So, for example, then I have a kind of if I wanted to jazz it, almost a bossa nova rhythm, right? So that you can have a lot of fun as an interpreter with arpeggios, because you can decide to accent different things, bring out different things, and it's a lot of fun. Of course, Bach, being the ultimate master, comes up with an arpeggio here that's totally cool, that nobody else came up with. The first part of it is quite simple. Any of us could figure this out. But then he goes on, and then he combines it, and then, of course, the great thing is this rhythm. So I've been beating the first four measures of this piece to death, and naturally the piece has more than the first four measures, so let's continue onward. Particularly once he has sort of twirled around a bit in D minor, and the bass starts to move now off of this pedal point. The first thing he does is the bass starts to move for the first time. Going from so that's a very interesting way to get to from the tonic into the dominant minor. What's interesting is we hold these notes here, but then when we change the bass against them, of course we create a whole new set of consonances, or in some cases dissonances. So this F or this D, which is completely innocuous here above a D bass, everything here is consonant. 5th, octave, and 10th. Now, all of a sudden, we have 6, and the 4, and the 2. Speaking of intervals above the bass, if you count up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we have this C to D, which makes us the interval of a second, and we have the C to the F, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, which is a 4th. That's why the figure bass symbol is 6, 4, 2, above this bass. Okay? And you notice that this same F is going to have a different color in relation to this bass than it does to this bass. Now look at this. Beautiful. 7th chord here. Created, we were just holding the harmony, but the bass descends, and now to another 6/4 chord, and then to this wonderful secondary dominant diminished chord, coming from the idea of an E7, basically, but it's just arpeggiated up in thirds, and there's no E in the chord. So you have this G sharp, spelling it up, G sharp, D, D, F, so secondary dominant to the minor dominant. And then this F7, and then a kind of a 4 chord, and basically we're in the key of A minor, but he's not, of course, being Bach, he's not going to give us A minor for a long time. And any A minor he gives us is going to be very transitional. To return to this arpeggio, this can be a rather complex pattern at the beginning for a lot of us, because it's a combination of all kinds of different motions. So how can we get about learning this? I would say that, for example, we're in 3/4 time. In 3/4 time, we've got 3 quarter notes to each measure. Each of those quarter notes is subdivided into 4 16th notes. If you think back to math, 4 over 16 equals 1 over 4. So then each quarter note, we have 4/16. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. All through the entire piece. Now, in order to get a hold or a handle on these arpeggios, what we should do is break them into smaller, manageable groups. And we could, for example, take each beat as an entity, like, and just practice that. Forwards and also backwards. Forwards, backwards. Now the next group, forwards and backwards. Many times. Or this is good for your flexibility, it's good for your mind. Forwards and backwards. So what I did, to recapitulate, I took each beat, I examined the subdivisions in each beat, 1, 2, 3, 4/16, and I just said, okay, I'm going to practice just those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, at least twice. Each group at least twice. But I can also go backwards. In fact, Bach did this a lot in his music. He was a great master of counterpoint, and so he would take his themes, run them forwards, run them backwards, invert them, and recombine them, etc., etc., with all the tricks of the contrapuntist's trade. But I think it's also, therefore, historically and musically valid to practice Bach in the same way, so that I can run each of the beats I just demonstrated that I ran forwards. We can, as you do on your video machine, do it in reverse. So I practiced it forwards, I practiced it backwards. Always twice, each beat twice. Now, I can also shift the groups of 4. So instead of playing 1, 2, 3, 4, I can play 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. I can do that forwards and backwards also. Each always twice. And that's a very effective way to practice. You can use this technique with any piece of any period, of any time, any place, and you will solve more problems in less time by that means of practicing than practically any other technique that I know of. All my students that have done it improve instantly in a quantum leap. So you could take that through this entire piece, either playing within the beats, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, always twice, always forwards and then backwards, so that it sounds like this. Always at least twice. And then what you do, you start stringing together these little pearls, and after a while you have a beautiful chain, a beautiful strand of pearls. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So that what we have done is we have practiced technique and music at the same time. It's good for your ear training, it's good for memory, and obviously good for technique. And it's very, very important to conserve flexibility, mental flexibility. And that's what this does.